most powerful man in Europe, spent the first hour of every morning arguing with a barber about sideburns. Not military strategy, not the reorganization of an empire, sideburns. The barber, a man named Constant, who later wrote a memoir that makes you wince and smile in equal measure, recorded that Napoleon would sit in his dressing gown, still half asleep, and complain that the left sideburn was longer than the right, or that the powder wasn't evenly applied, or that the scissors were too cold. And this was the man who had crushed the Austrian army at Marengo and was about to redraw the map of Germany. To me, the most unsettling part is not that he cared about his sideburns. It's that he cared while simultaneously dictating orders for the execution of traitors, as if vanity and terror were two sides of the same coin. The routine began long before dawn, but not in the way you might imagine from paintings of the emperor astride a white horse, surveying the battlefield with a calm, almost divine certainty. In reality, Napoleon woke up violently. His valets described the sound as a gasp, sometimes a shout, as if he had been falling in a dream and hit the ground. The curtains would be ripped open by a servant who had been sleeping on a mattress in the same room, not out of loyalty, but because Napoleon demanded that someone be within arm's reach at all times, even while he slept. When I first read this, I was struck by how lonely that sounds. A man surrounded by hundreds of thousands of soldiers, sleeping with a servant on the floor next to his bed. He would lie there for another hour, flat on his back, staring at the ceiling. This was not meditation. It was more like a kind of horizontal command center. His secretary, Bourrienne, would sit on a stool beside the bed, and Napoleon would dictate dispatches, letters, and orders while still tangled in the sheets. On one occasion, Bourrienne later wrote, he was reading back a lengthy directive about troop movements in Italy, and Napoleon interrupted to ask if the coffee was ready. On another, he complained that his left foot had gone numb and demanded that Bourrienne, his secretary, not a physician, massage it. The man who had crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame did not believe in waiting for a doctor. The coffee arrived around 6 a.m, and it was a disaster. Napoleon was notoriously picky about coffee, but also utterly incapable of making it himself, or even explaining what he wanted. The servants would brew pot after pot, and he would take one sip, grimace, and shove it away. Constant wrote that some mornings they went through 7 or 8 attempts before Napoleon grunted in approval, at which point he would drink it scalding hot in 3 gulps, then demand another. It was not a refined palate. It was a ritual of irritation, a way of asserting dominance over the very people who were trying to serve him. And if you're listening to this in the dark, with your eyes closed, imagine that silence that fell over the kitchens at the Tuileries Palace every morning when the cup was rejected again. Then came the bath. If Napoleon's mornings began in bed, they truly began in water. He soaked for 2 hours, often 3, in a copper tub filled with water so hot that the servants wrapped the handles in cloth to avoid burning their hands. The water was changed twice during the bath, always reheated to the same near boiling temperature, and Napoleon would sit there, steam rising around his face, and transact the business of an empire. He dictated letters, received reports, and occasionally bargained with his ministers, all while up to his neck in hot water. An Austrian diplomat once complained, in a letter to his own government, that he had been forced to negotiate a treaty renewal, while the Emperor of the French sat naked and pink, occasionally asking for the sponge to be wrung out. The diplomat wrote that it was impossible to maintain a sense of dignity when your counterpart looked like a boiled prawn. But the bath was not simply eccentric, it was medical. Napoleon's doctors advised it for his chronic stomach pain, which was likely an ulcer caused by years of stress and erratic eating. The irony is rich. The man who moved armies across Europe in days could not digest a meal without agony. His doctors also prescribed a strict diet, which Napoleon ignored completely. He ate quickly, greedily, often standing up, shoving food into his mouth with his hands, not from hunger, but from impatience. He considered eating a waste of time, so he tried to finish in under 10 minutes, and then complained that his stomach hurt afterwards. The contradiction is so consistent, it almost becomes a pattern. Every attempt to save time turned into more time lost to his own body's rebellion, and the meals themselves were baffling. Napoleon loved pasta, but only if it was undercooked. He loved chicken, but only if it was boiled and served cold. He loved champagne, but would mix it with a cheap red wine and drink it lukewarm. His chefs despaired. One of them, a man named Dunand, wrote in his private journal that the emperor had the palate of a soldier and the manners of a wolf, but that he was also capable of tasting a single grain of salt too many in a sauce and sending the entire dish back. So he was not without discernment, just a very strange, personal discernment that made no sense to anyone else. By mid-morning, the work began in earnest, but the setting was hardly a grand throne room. Napoleon worked at a small, cluttered desk in a study that Bourrienne described as piles of paper, books stacked on the floor, and the remains of breakfast hardening on a plate. He would sit for hours, writing relentlessly, often with a half-eaten biscuit in one hand and a pen in the other. He rarely looked up. Visitors were received in this chaos, generals, diplomats, artists, and they stood while he wrote, waiting to be acknowledged. When he finally spoke, it was often without looking at them, which made the encounter feel both intimate and humiliating. You were physically close to him, but psychologically, he was already planning next month's campaign. But there were moments when the mask slipped entirely. Constant recorded a morning when a young officer arrived with news of a defeat in Spain. Napoleon listened, nodded, and then asked the officer if he thought the new uniforms for the artillery looked better in dark blue or navy. The officer, stunned, stammered something in reply. Napoleon laughed, a short, barking sound, and then dictated a letter of reprimand to the general in charge of the Spanish front. Then he returned to the uniform question, as if the two things belonged to the same ledger. I honestly cannot decide if this is brave or foolish. Perhaps both. Perhaps the only way to rule a continent without losing your mind is to treat uniforms and defeats with the same level of emotional investment. Lunch was at noon, but it was rarely a rest. Napoleon ate in 10 minutes, sometimes while walking through the gardens, a napkin tucked into his collar, a plate in his hand. He would talk with his mouth full, scattering breadcrumbs across important documents. He drank watered wine, but sometimes forgot and drank it strong, which would leave him drowsy and irritable by mid-afternoon. His doctors warned him that the wine was aggravating his stomach, but he shrugged and said it was better than being sober. There is something unbearably human in that refusal. The greatest military mind of the age, surrendering to a bad habit because he could not bear the alternative. The afternoon was given to councils and audiences, but Napoleon was notoriously impatient with both. He would pace the room, interrupt speakers, finish their sentences, and sometimes walk out entirely if he lost interest. A Spanish envoy once traveled for weeks to deliver a message, only to have Napoleon wave him silent, say, "I already know," and turn his back. The envoy stood there, frozen, for several minutes, unsure if he was dismissed or being tested. Eventually, a servant touched his elbow and guided him out. No one could say whether the emperor had actually known the contents of the message or had simply guessed and bluffed. That ambiguity was as much a weapon as any cannon. And through all of this, the body of Napoleon kept interrupting. He would clutch his stomach mid-conversation, grimace, and reach for a small flask of medicine that his physician had prepared. He would yawn loudly during diplomatic speeches. He would fall asleep in council meetings. On one documented occasion, he slept through a discussion about the budget for the Navy, and when he woke, he simply said, "Increase it," and walked out. The ministers exchanged glances, but no one contradicted him. The man who slept at the council table was the same man who could march at the head of an army for 16 hours without rest. The body was a contradiction, and he treated it like a disobedient horse. He kicked it until it worked, and then wondered why it kept stumbling. By 6 in the evening, he was often back in his private quarters, and the routine shifted again. He would change into a simpler coat, the famous gray overcoat, and sit by the fire with a book or a stack of reports. He read fast and annotated everything, often writing in the margins so aggressively that the pen tore through the paper. His library at the Tuileries contained thousands of volumes, but he treated them as tools, not treasures. He underlined, folded pages, scribbled questions. One of his librarians later complained that the emperor had ruined a first edition of Caesar's commentaries by writing, "This is a lie," next to a passage about a river crossing. Napoleon had no reverence for the past. He was busy rewriting it. And then, late in the evening, the loneliness that had been kept at bay all day crept back in. He would call for Josephine, or later, Marie-Louise, but often they were already asleep. he would wander the corridors of the palace, half-dressed, a candle in his hand, talking to himself. The guards had learned not to startle him. On one night, a young sentry who did not recognize the emperor nearly shot him, mistaking his shuffling figure for an intruder. Napoleon simply said, "Good reflexes," and turned down another hall. The sentry later fainted. What strikes me most about all of this is how much effort it took to keep the myth alive. The paintings show a man in gold and white, calm, commanding, untroubled. But the daily reality was a man who fought his own body every waking hour, who could not sit still, who ate like a refugee and bathed like a Roman senator, who treated his servants as furniture and his ministers as errand boys. And yet, from all that chaos, he produced order, or at least the appearance of order. The codes, the campaigns, the institutions, they came out of the same mind that argued about sideburns and fell asleep during budget meetings. I have no definitive answer for why this worked. Only the guess that perhaps greatness is not the opposite of absurdity, but its most elaborate disguise. And as the last candle flickered out in his study, Napoleon would finally lie down, exhausted, the coffee still bitter on his tongue. But he did not sleep peacefully. The valets reported that he often cried out in his sleep, short phrases in Italian, his first language fragments of arguments or commands. One night, according to Constant, he sat bolt upright, pointed at the darkness, and said, "I will not retreat." Then he fell back onto the pillow and snored. No one dared to ask in the morning what he had been dreaming of. And yet, when dawn came, he was already at his desk, as if the night had never happened. The dream about retreat, about pointing into darkness, was not mentioned by anyone. The servants knew better than to bring up anything that happened after midnight. Napoleon sat with his back to the window, the gray coat already buttoned, a fresh cup of coffee at his elbow. He took one sip, made a face, and pushed it away without a word. The barber was already behind him, combing the thin strands of hair forward to hide the receding hairline that no portrait would ever admit existed. This was the moment when the mask of the emperor was literally put on, strand by strand, and the man who had shouted in Italian in the dark became the man who would sign the death warrant of a deserter before breakfast. But the mask was never quite perfect. Constant, the valet, noted that Napoleon had a habit of scratching his scalp while dictating, which meant that the carefully arranged hair would come loose and fall into his eyes. He would then snap at the barber, who would rush forward with the comb, and the whole ritual would begin again. It took, on average, 45 minutes to get Napoleon presentable, and he hated every second of it. To him, the body was an obstacle, a thing that required maintenance he had no patience for. And yet, he was obsessively sensitive to how he appeared. He once spent an entire afternoon deciding whether to wear the green uniform of the chasseur or the blue of the grenadiers for a meeting with the Tsar's ambassador, and then, after changing 4 times, settled on the one he had worn first. When I first read this, I was struck by the sheer waste of energy, a mind that could calculate the logistics of 100,000 men could not decide on a jacket. After the toilette came the first round of morning audiences, and these were held in a peculiar state of undress. Napoleon would keep his dressing gown on over his uniform trousers, like a man who could not quite decide if he was at war or at home. Visitors were received in this half costume. A general would walk in, salute, and find the Emperor of the French standing in wool socks and a silk robe, holding a biscuit. The effect was strangely disarming. The diplomat who had prepared a formal speech would suddenly forget his lines, faced with a man who looked like an uncle interrupted during a nap. And Napoleon knew this. He used the dressing gown as a weapon. One ambassador later wrote in his memoirs that he had spent 3 months preparing a petition about trade routes, only to have Napoleon listen while picking biscuit crumbs off his chest, then say, "I'll have an answer by Tuesday," and turn away. The ambassador never got an answer on Tuesday. He waited a week, then received a note that said, "Your request is denied," signed in a scrawl that looked like a bird had walked across the paper. But if the morning audiences were a comedy of crumbs and silk, the mid-morning work sessions were something closer to a circus. Napoleon liked to dictate letters to several secretaries at once, pacing the room and switching between subjects without warning. He would start on a letter to his brother Joseph in Spain, tell Joseph to hold the line at Madrid and not to negotiate with the guerrillas. Then, without a pause, he would turn to another secretary and write to the Minister of the Interior, "I want the streetlights on the Rue de Rivoli to be taller. The current ones are too short for the avenue. And send a note to the Louvre. Tell them to speed up the painting of my portrait. I want it done before spring." The secretaries, 3 or 4 of them, would scribble furiously, trying to keep up. And if one stopped to ask for clarification, Napoleon would snap, "You are not listening," and repeat the sentence at double speed. Constant recalled that one young secretary, only 3 weeks on the job, burst into tears in the middle of a dictation and had to be led out of the room. Napoleon watched him go, shrugged, and said to Bourrienne, "That one won't last." He was right. The man was reassigned to the archives the next day. And yet, for all his impatience, Napoleon had an extraordinary capacity for detail. He could dictate a letter about army supply lines, and then, in the same breath, correct the spelling of a town name in a minor province. He knew the exact number of cannonballs in the arsenal at Strasbourg, and complained when a shipment of boots was 200 pairs short. His memory for numbers was almost inhuman, and he used it to keep everyone on edge. A minister who quoted a figure that was even slightly off would be interrupted, corrected, and then silenced for the rest of the meeting. The men around him lived in fear of being caught in a mistake, because Napoleon never forgot a number, and he never let one slide. This was not genius. It was a kind of obsessive control, a need to know everything so that no one could surprise him. But control, as Napoleon learned every afternoon, could not be extended to his own stomach. By 11 o'clock, he would begin to shift in his chair, pressing a hand to his abdomen. The ulcer, or whatever it was, would start its daily rebellion. He would reach for a small porcelain jar filled with a dark paste, a medicine concocted by his physician, and eat a spoonful of it with a grimace. Then he would resume dictating, but his voice would be tighter, and the intervals between sentences would grow longer. The secretaries learned to slow down during these moments, to wait for the next burst. Sometimes it never came. He would stand up abruptly, walk to the window, and stand there in silence for 2 or 3 minutes, his back to the room. No one dared to speak. Then he would turn, sit down, and say, "Continue," as if nothing had happened. Lunch was a brief ceasefire, but not a pleasant one. He insisted on eating alone, or at least with only a single aide, and the food was the same nonsense as before. A boiled chicken cold, a plate of undercooked pasta, a glass of watered wine, or sometimes the disgusting mix of champagne and red wine that his doctors had given up trying to forbid. He would eat standing at a small table in his study, flipping through reports with one hand, shoving food into his mouth with the other. The napkin, once tucked into his collar, would slide down to his lap, and he would not bother to retrieve it. One of the cooks, a man named Dunend, who had trained in Paris's finest kitchens, wrote in his private journal that he had considered resigning 3 times in the first year because the emperor treated food as fuel and the chef as a mechanic. I honestly cannot decide if this is admirable or pitiable. To have no joy in eating, to see a meal as only a distraction from work. It seems less like discipline and more like a kind of poverty of experience. The afternoon brought the heaviest work, councils of state, military briefings, and the endless paperwork of an empire. But it also brought the most absurd moments. One of Napoleon's habits, recorded by several witnesses, was that he would interrupt official meetings to draw maps. Not maps of existing territory, but maps of imaginary battles. He would take a piece of paper, sketch out a terrain with hills, rivers, and forests, and then move small objects, a salt shaker, a pen, a candle across it like toy soldiers. The ministers, generals, and secretaries would sit in silence as the emperor played out an invasion of a country that did not exist, complete with flanking maneuvers and supply line calculations. Nobody knew whether to take notes or to applaud. One general later confided to his diary that he had once spent an entire afternoon watching Napoleon lose an imaginary battle. Then scrap the paper and say, "That would never have worked anyway." The general was not sure if it was a joke, a lesson, or a symptom of something deeper. And it was not just maps. Napoleon had a habit of memorizing the names and faces of every soldier who served in his personal guard, a battalion of several hundred men. He would walk through the ranks at inspection, stop in front of a private, and say, "You were at Jena, yes. You took a wound in the left shoulder." The soldier, stunned, would confirm. Napoleon would nod and move on. The effect on morale was incalculable. The men adored him for it. But Bourrienne later revealed that Napoleon spent hours before every review studying a list of names and injuries, memorizing them like a script. It was not a miracle of memory. It was a calculated performance, as rehearsed as a play. And yet, does that make it less genuine? The soldier felt seen, and that feeling was real, even if the mechanism was a trick. I have no definitive answer for where the performance ends and the man begins. Perhaps. There is no line. By 4 in the afternoon, the energy would begin to wane. Napoleon would lean back in his chair, close his eyes, and sometimes fall asleep for 10 minutes. He called it the quarter hour of the dead, a phrase that made his attendants uneasy. He would wake with a start, rub his face, and resume work as if nothing had happened. But the sleep was never restful. He would twitch, mutter. And once, according to Constant, he grabbed the arm of a secretary who was standing too close and said, "The bridge is out. We need to reroute." The secretary stood frozen until Napoleon opened his eyes, let go, and said, "Never mind. Get me the Minister of War." These catnaps, combined with his erratic diet and the pain in his stomach, made him irritable by the early evening. He would snap at servants for no reason, then apologize in a gruff voice that sounded almost embarrassed. He would pace the room, pick up a book, read 3 pages, throw it down, and pick up another. He had a habit of straightening papers on his desk obsessively, aligning the edges with his fingertips, and if a page was even a millimeter out of place, he would adjust it. This was the same man who had ordered the execution of hundreds of prisoners after the siege of Jaffa, and who had wept at the death of a favorite general. The same hands that signed treaties with the Pope also arranged paper clips in a perfect row. The contrast is not a paradox. It is a portrait of a man who needed order because his inner life was a storm. And then, when the last dispatch was signed and the final minister dismissed, there came a quiet hour that Napoleon guarded jealously. He would call for a carriage, a plain one without imperial markings, and take a short ride through the streets of Paris. He sat by the window, watching the people who did not know he was there. A baker closing his shop, a woman calling her children inside, a street lamp lighter making his rounds, and Napoleon, the man who had conquered Italy and Egypt and Austria, watched them with an expression that his valet described as sad, but not unhappy. He said nothing during these rides, and the carriage returned to the Tuileries as the bells of Notre Dame rang 7. If you are listening to this with your eyes closed, imagine that moment, a city of 500,000 people, and the most powerful man among them, silent, riding home in the dark, a ghost in his own capital. But that quiet never lasted, because as soon as he stepped back inside the palace, the hunger returned not for food, but for company. He would send for Josephine, and if she was away or occupied, he would pace the halls, restless, picking up objects and putting them down, as if the silence itself itched. He could not bear to be alone with his own mind, and yet he could not bear the small talk of his court. So he retreated to his study, to the same cluttered desk, and read dispatches from the front until his eyes burned. And somewhere around 11, he would call for Constant, and the ritual of undressing began, slower now, more tired, the barber summoned again to comb out the hair that had been so carefully arranged that morning. And as he lay down, the same fear that had jolted him awake at 4 a.m. returned in another form. He asked for a candle to be left burning on the nightstand, and for a servant to remain in the room, not on the floor this time, but on a chair by the door, within earshot. He needed to know that he was not alone in the dark, and when he finally closed his eyes, the last thing he saw was the candlelight flickering against the wall, casting shadows that looked, for a moment, like an army on the march. But he did not sleep. The candle burned low, the wax pooling on the brass holder, and Napoleon lay on his side, watching the shadows move across the wall. They shifted with the draft from the window, swelling and shrinking like a living thing, and he followed them with his eyes as if tracking a formation. His breathing slowed, but his mind did not. The servants, listening from the chair by the door, could hear him murmur fragments of Italian, sometimes a curse, sometimes a name. One night, Constant recorded, he heard the emperor say, "They are not retreating, they are waiting." Then silence. Then a snore that sounded more like a growl. The servant did not sleep that night, afraid that if he closed his eyes, the emperor would wake and ask him for a report on the dream. And in the morning, the cycle began again, but with a difference. On certain days, perhaps once or twice a week, Napoleon did not wake at 4. He woke at 6 or even 7, and when he opened his eyes, there was a heaviness in them that his attendants had learned to recognize. These were the mornings when the mask was harder to put on. He would wave away the barber, refuse the coffee, and sit on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. The valets would stand in silence, waiting for the signal. Sometimes it came after 5 minutes. Sometimes it took half an hour. And when he finally looked up, he was not the emperor of the French. He was a man who had not slept well, whose stomach was already twisting, whose jaw was tight with a pain he would not name. And on these mornings, he sometimes did something extraordinary. He canceled his audiences. The entire machinery of the court, the generals and ministers and ambassadors who had prepared their reports and polished their shoes, was told to wait. Napoleon would retreat to a small room off his study, a room that no one else was allowed to enter. It contained a single armchair, a fireplace, and a painting of his mother, a woman he had not seen in years, but whose stern face he kept close. He would sit in that chair, staring at the fire, and give no orders. Bourrienne, who saw this only once, wrote that the emperor looked like a man waiting for a battle that would never come. And when he emerged, hours later, he would be brisk, efficient, and cold. But the servants knew that the world had tilted slightly, and that the afternoon's work would be done in a different key, quieter, sharper, with less tolerance for error. But these moments of withdrawal were rare, and they were quickly buried under the weight of routine. The routine was the thing that held Napoleon together, the scaffolding around a mind that otherwise would have collapsed into the chaos it feared most. And the routine demanded that, by 8 o'clock, he be seated at his desk, the letters already piled, the coffee already cold. One of the secretaries, a man named Maineville who succeeded Bourrienne, noted that Napoleon's handwriting changed over the course of the day, tight and legible in the morning, larger and more erratic by the evening, as if the pen itself was losing patience. And if a letter was particularly important, Napoleon would copy it twice, then burn the first version, saying, "The first draft is always wrong." This, from a man who dictated entire battle orders in under 3 minutes. And yet, for all his speed, Napoleon was capable of a stillness that unsettled everyone in the room. When he was thinking, really thinking, he would stop moving entirely. His hands would rest on the desk, his eyes would fix on a point on the wall, and he would breathe so slowly that the secretaries would check to see if he was still alive. These pauses could last 2, sometimes 3 minutes. Then he would blink and say, "Continue," as if the pause had never happened. What was happening inside those pauses? Bourrienne guessed that he was running through conversations, anticipating objections, rewriting the script. But I wonder if it was something simpler, a man giving his mind permission to detach, to float above the room for a moment, before diving back into the mess of the day. The mess was always waiting. In the middle of a dictation, Napoleon would receive a visitor who had traveled from the other end of Europe, a merchant from Constantinople, a bishop from Poland, a delegation of scholars from the Institute. And each visitor was treated according to a script that Napoleon had written in his head years before. The merchant was kept standing for 10 minutes, then offered a chair, then asked about the price of grain in the Ottoman Empire. The bishop was addressed in Italian, which he did not speak, and then handed a letter to deliver to the Pope. The scholars were questioned about their latest research, interrupted, corrected, and then dismissed with a curt, "Send me a copy." One delegation, a group of 7 astronomers from the Paris Observatory, arrived with a map of the solar system and left with a note from Napoleon suggesting that they recalculate the orbit of Jupiter. He said, noticed an error in their previous publication. The astronomers later admitted that he was right, but the center of the day, the moment around which everything else revolved, was the Council of State. Twice a week, at 2 in the afternoon, the highest ministers of the empire gathered in the Salle du Conseil at the Tuileries. They stood around a long table covered in green cloth, and Napoleon sat at the head, flanked by the Arch-Chancellor and the Arch-Treasurer. The atmosphere, according to one counselor, was a mixture of a classroom and a courtroom. Napoleon would open the session with a question, sometimes a policy question about taxation or conscription, sometimes a question that seemed to come from nowhere. Why does bread in the provinces cost 2 centimes more than in Paris? And the ministers would scramble to answer, knowing that a half-prepared answer would be torn apart. What is hardest to convey about these councils is the quality of Napoleon's attention. He did not simply listen, he watched. He watched the hands of the minister who was speaking, the way the man shifted his weight, the way he blinked when he was uncertain. He could tell when a minister was lying, and he would call it out without warning. "You are not telling me what you think. You are telling me what you think I want to hear. Start again." And the minister would start again, often stammering. One counselor, a seasoned diplomat named Talleyrand, who had survived the Revolution and the Directory, said that he never felt more exposed than when he stood before Napoleon in council. "He sees through you like a pane of glass," Talleyrand wrote, "and the glass is dirty." And yet, Napoleon was not infallible. The same counselor also recorded moments when the emperor was simply wrong about a piece of intelligence, about the mood in a distant province, about the strength of a fortress. And when he was wrong, he did not admit it. He corrected himself without acknowledging the error by issuing a new order that quietly contradicted the old one, and then acting as if the first order had never existed. The ministers learned to adapt, to treat every imperial decree as provisional until a counter decree appeared. It was exhausting. A Prussian diplomat, observing a council session, wrote that the French ministers had the air of men who were always waiting for a door to slam. But if the council was a trial for the ministers, it was also a performance for Napoleon. He needed the audience, needed the tension, needed to feel that he was the only one in the room who knew the truth. And to maintain that fiction, he would sometimes say things that were not true, small things, like the date of a battle or the name of a general, and wait to see if anyone corrected him. No one ever did. And then he would smile, a thin smile that barely moved the corners of his mouth, and say, "Good. I see you are all paying attention." It was a test, and the test was always passed because the alternative was unthinkable. After the council, there was a pause an hour, sometimes less, before the next round of meetings. During this hour, Napoleon often walked in the gardens of the Tuileries, alone except for a single aide who walked 3 paces behind. The people of Paris could see him through the iron gates, a short man in a gray coat, walking with his hands clasped behind his back. Some of them waved, some of them shouted, "Vive l'Empereur." He would acknowledge them with a slight nod, but he did not stop. And the aide, walking behind, would later report that Napoleon spoke to himself during these walks. A quiet, continuous stream of words, like a man rehearsing a speech or arguing with an invisible opponent. What did he say? The aide never repeated it, but he described the expression on Napoleon's face as the look of a man who is winning an argument with someone who cannot answer back. The walks ended at a specific spot, near a small fountain shaped like a lion's head. Napoleon would stop there, gaze at the water for a moment, and then turn abruptly and walk back to the palace. The aide learned to stay silent during this turn because the mood had shifted. The man who had been talking to himself was gone, replaced by the emperor who was about to receive the Russian ambassador. And the transition was so seamless, so complete, that the aide sometimes doubted whether the walk had happened at all. And if you are listening to this with your eyes closed, imagine that moment. A fountain, a lion's head, a man staring at water, and then the curtain descending. The afternoons were a blur of papers, signatures, and meetings that all seemed to blend together. Napoleon worked at a pace that exhausted everyone around him. He would sign 100 documents in an hour, barely reading them, trusting his secretaries to have filtered out the nonsense. But when a document caught his eye, a missing comma, an ambiguous phrase, he would stop, read it twice, and then demand a revised version. On one occasion, a treaty with the Kingdom of Naples was held up for 3 days because Napoleon objected to a single preposition. Sus instead of dans, he said. It changes the meaning entirely. The treaty was rewritten, and the Neapolitan ambassador, who had already signed, had to sign again. No one knew whether Napoleon was genuinely concerned about the nuance or simply asserting dominance. In the end, it did not matter. The preposition was changed, and the ambassador learned never to leave a document unattended. And through all this, the body kept interrupting. The ulcer, the headaches, the bouts of nausea that sent Napoleon to a couch in his study for 20 minutes. His physician, Corvisart, was constantly at his side, a quiet presence in the corner of the room, holding a leather case filled with remedies. Napoleon resented him, but needed him. He would take the medicine, grimace, and say, "This is poison." Corvisart would reply, "It is rhubarb, sire." And Napoleon would mutter something about the incompetence of doctors and go back to work. The diagnosis, a gastric ulcer, probably exacerbated by stress and poor diet, was never officially confirmed, but the symptoms were recorded in the physician's diary, which was later published. Reading it, I was struck by the sheer normality of the suffering. The most powerful man in Europe reached for the same kind of chalky, bitter medicine that any bourgeois merchant might have used. The body does not care about titles. Evening arrived, and with it a change in the quality of the light. The candles were lit, the fire was stoked, and Napoleon withdrew to his private salon, where he dined alone or with a single companion. The food was no better at dinner than at lunch. The same cold chicken, the same undercooked pasta, the same bottle of watered wine. But the mood was different. In the evening, Napoleon was quieter, more reflective. He would ask questions about his guests' family, about books he had read, about the weather in the countryside. For a few minutes, he might have passed for an ordinary man, interested in ordinary things. But then he would bring the conversation back to a campaign or a political appointment, and the guest would remember where he was. And as the fire burned low, Napoleon would reach for a book, usually a military history, sometimes a novel, once in a while an old copy of Ossian, the Scottish epic he loved because it sounded like a battle. He read aloud in a low voice, half to himself and half to the room. The guest would sit in silence, listening to lines about warriors and mist, about heroes who died young and were mourned by the wind. And when he finished, he would close the book and say, "They understood honor." Then he would fall silent, and the guest would wait for the dismissal, which came when Napoleon stood, nodded, and walked toward the bedroom without another word. But on one evening, recorded by a young officer named Caulaincourt, Napoleon did not turn toward the bedroom. He stood by the window, looking out at the dark garden, and said, "I sometimes wonder if honor is not just a word we use to justify the things we cannot explain." Caulaincourt, who had lost his own father in the wars, did not know how to answer. Napoleon turned, smiled without warmth, and said, "But we must die for it anyway." And then he walked into the bedroom, and the door closed, and the officer stood alone in the room with the dying fire, and the echo of a sentence he would remember for the rest of his life. The door closed, and the officer stood in the room with the dying fire, and the echo of a sentence he would remember for the rest of his life. But inside the bedroom, Napoleon did not lie down immediately. He stood at the foot of the bed, still in his gray coat, staring at the candle that had been left burning on the nightstand. The shadows it cast were different here, smaller, more contained, as if the room itself resisted the chaos of the outside world. He reached out and touched the flame with his fingertip, held it there for a second, then pulled back. The valet, who was preparing the night clothes, saw the gesture and said nothing. It was not the first time the emperor had tested his own threshold for pain, and it would not be the last. There was a woman in this story, of course, and she has been present in the margins of these chapters without ever stepping into the center. Her name was Josephine, and she was the one person who could make Napoleon lower the mask without meaning to. But their marriage was not the tender union that the paintings suggest. It was a battlefield of its own, fought in whispers and silences and letters that burned with a heat that neither of them could sustain. When I first read the correspondence between them, I was struck by how uneven it was. His letters were long, feverish, full of demands for her to join him, to write more often, to love him as fiercely as he loved her. Her letters were shorter, careful, sometimes evasive. She was not cruel. She was simply not capable of matching his intensity, and he could not forgive her for that. The letters from Italy, written during the campaign of 1796, are almost painful to read. Napoleon, then a young general in his 20s, wrote to Josephine as if she were a fortress he had to conquer. "I wake full of you. Your portrait and the intoxicating memory of last night have left no rest to my senses." He wrote that he would go to bed with the hope that we will be together soon. He wrote that if she did not join him, he would abandon the army and ride back to Paris. And Josephine, who was in Paris attending parties and perhaps taking lovers, wrote back with polite affection that drove him mad. She was not indifferent. She was simply a woman of the world, and he was a man who had never learned how to love without total possession. Years later, after the divorce, Napoleon spoke of Josephine with a tenderness that surprised everyone who heard it. He arranged for her to keep the title of Empress and the Chateau of Malmaison and a generous pension. He visited her after the divorce, sitting in her garden, talking for hours about the roses she had planted. But he never stayed the night. The valets noted that he would return to the Tuileries with a heaviness in his step, and that he would drink an extra glass of wine before bed. And if anyone mentioned her name in his presence, a subtle change would come over his face, not anger, but something closer to regret. I honestly cannot decide if the divorce was a political necessity or a personal failure. Perhaps it was both, and the two cannot be disentangled. But Josephine was not the only person who bore the weight of Napoleon's affection. His family, his mother Letizia, his brothers Joseph and Lucian and Louis, his sisters Alyssa and Pauline and Caroline, were both his instruments and his victims. He placed them on thrones across Europe. Joseph became king of Spain, Louis became king of Holland, Jerome became king of Westphalia. And one by one, they disappointed him. Joseph was too cautious, Louis too sickly, Jerome too reckless. Napoleon's letters to them are a masterclass in controlled fury. He wrote to Joseph in Spain, "You are not governing, you are hiding. You must show yourself to the people. You must ride through the streets without a guard. You must be a king, not a frightened man." Joseph did not reply for a month, and when he did, it was to ask for more troops. What Napoleon never understood, or perhaps understood, but refused to accept, was that his family did not share his hunger. They had been poor in Corsica, scraping together a living in a stone house with a leaky roof. Napoleon had lifted them out of that poverty and placed them in palaces. But he had also demanded that they think like him, move like him, burn like him. And they could not. The fire that consumed Napoleon was not a gift he could give to others. It was a solitude that only he could inhabit. And so he wrote letters that grew shorter, colder, until they became dispatches. King of Holland, your budget is unacceptable. Reduce expenditure by 20%. Respond within the week. N. And yet, for all his harshness, he could be surprisingly tender with those who served him loyally. When his favorite general, Desaix, was killed at Marengo, Napoleon wept openly, not the controlled tear of a statesman, but the raw grief of a man who had lost a brother. He ordered a monument built, and he spoke of Desaix for years afterward, always with a note of pain in his voice. When a young officer named Marbot was wounded at Austerlitz, Napoleon stopped his horse, dismounted, and personally tore strips of cloth from his own shirt to bind the wound. Marbot later wrote that the emperor sat with him until the surgeon arrived, asking him about his family, telling him he would recover. And when the surgeon finally came, Napoleon stood up, looked at Marbot, and said, "You will be a colonel before the year is out." He was as good as his word. These moments of tenderness are the hardest to reconcile with the rest of the portrait. How could the same man who ordered the execution of prisoners in Jaffa, who let his own brother struggle alone in a hostile kingdom, who divorced the woman he loved because she could not bear him an heir, how could that same man sit in the mud with a wounded officer, tearing his own shirt into bandages? I have no definitive answer, only the observation that cruelty and kindness are not opposites. They are sometimes the same muscle, flexed in different directions. And Napoleon flexed everything. The court at the Tuileries was a theater, and everyone in it knew their role. The marshals, the ministers, the ambassadors, the servants, all of them moved according to a script that Napoleon had written, revised, and memorized. But the script had gaps, and those gaps were filled by the people who knew how to read the silence. One of them was Constant, the valet, who understood that when Napoleon refused to speak, it meant he was listening. Another was Duroc, the grand marshal of the palace, who could anticipate the emperor's needs before they were spoken. And a third was the Empress Marie-Louise, who arrived in 1810 as a political bride, and learned within months that her husband was not the monster the Austrian court had warned her about, but that he was not the hero of the legends either. Marie-Louise was 18 years old when she married Napoleon, who was 40. She had been raised in the stiff, ceremonial world of the Habsburgs, where every gesture was regulated and every word was weighed. Napoleon, by contrast, ate with his hands, interrupted conversations, and walked around the palace in his dressing gown. She found him baffling at first, then endearing, then exhausting. She wrote to her father, the Emperor of Austria, that Napoleon was kind but impossible to keep up with. He would wake her in the middle of the night to tell her about a dream he had had about a battle. He would insist that she learn to ride, and then criticize her posture. He would ask her opinion about political matters, and then answer his own question before she could speak. And yet, she also recorded that he was gentle with her in private, that he called her by a pet name in German, and that he held her hand when she was afraid of the thunder. Their son, the King of Rome, was born in 1811, and for a brief period, the court was suffused with a warmth that no one had anticipated. Napoleon became, for a few months, a different man. He would leave council meetings early to visit the nursery. He would hold the child in his arms, bouncing him gently, whispering things in Italian. He ordered a small set of toy soldiers for the boy and a miniature cannon that actually fired blanks. The valets said they had never seen the emperor laugh so freely as when the little king picked up a wooden sword and pointed it at a porcelain duck. And for a moment, it seemed that the machine of empire might have a heart after all. But the heart did not soften the machine. It only made the later rupture more painful. When the disasters of 1812 and 1813 began to unfold, the visits to the nursery became rarer. The toy soldiers were packed away. The conversations at dinner grew shorter, and the laughter stopped. Marie-Louise watched her husband retreat into the same gray, focused silence that had preceded every campaign. She wrote, years later, that she knew the empire was falling not because of the military reports, but because Napoleon stopped asking about the boy's first words. The weight of command was not something he could share. He carried it alone, and the people around him felt it as a physical pressure. The marshals who had fought beside him in Italy and Egypt began to feel it differently. They were older now, richer, more cautious. They had estates to manage, families to protect. And Napoleon, still demanding the same reckless courage he had demanded in his 20s, did not notice that they had changed. He blamed them for the defeats, accused them of cowardice, and replaced them with younger men who had not yet learned to fear him. The letters he wrote to his generals in 1813 are almost unbearable to read. Accusations, threats, reminders of past favors, and beneath it all, a desperation that he could not bring himself to name. And yet, they did not leave him. not then. They stayed because they did not know how to leave. Because Napoleon had built a system in which loyalty was the only currency that mattered, and disloyalty was the only crime that could not be forgiven. A marshal of the empire who abandoned its emperor would lose everything: his title, his wealth, his honor. And so they stayed, grinding their teeth, writing letters to their wives about how they could not endure another winter in Russia, another campaign in Germany, another year of the emperor's relentless will. The winter of 1812 was the worst. The retreat from Moscow was not a military defeat in the usual sense. It was a destruction of the imagination. The soldiers who stumbled back across the Niemen were not the same men who had marched into Russia 5 months earlier. They had seen comrades freeze to death in the snow, had eaten their own horses, had watched the flames of Moscow consume the city they had conquered. And Napoleon, riding in a sledge ahead of the main army, reached Paris before the news of the disaster had fully arrived. He sat in his study, staring at the same cluttered desk, and began to write letters of consolation to the families of the dead. He wrote 1,000 of them, or so it seemed, and in each one he used the same phrase: he died for France. The secretaries noticed that the phrase was written in a different hand on each letter, the emperor's hand, holding the pen so tightly that the paper tore. But he did not weep, not for the soldiers. The tears had been spent on Desaix, on Lannes, on the few men he had loved as friends. For the thousands of anonymous dead, he had only the phrase, repeated like a prayer. And if you are listening to this in the dark, with your eyes closed, imagine that scene. A man alone in a room, writing 1,000 letters, each one saying the same thing. Each one a small stone laid on a mountain of grief that he could not allow himself to feel. He slept that night on a couch in his study, still in his boots. The valets covered him with a coat and left the candle burning. And when he woke at 4 a.m, he walked to the window and looked out at the dark city. He had been gone for 6 months. The Paris that he saw was the same as the one he had left, but he knew, with a certainty that pressed against his chest like a stone, that he was not the same. The mask was still there, carefully arranged, but the face underneath had changed. The mirror, when he finally looked into it, showed him a man who had already begun to fade, and who knew it. The mirror showed him a man who had already begun to fade, and he looked at that reflection with a stillness that was almost clinical, as if he were examining a map of a country he no longer intended to visit. The valet who stood behind him, holding a fresh coat, saw the emperor's hand rise to touch his own cheek, tracing the line of his jaw, and then drop. He said nothing. The coat was put on, the hair was combed forward, and the mask was restored. But the mirror had been moved that morning. Constant had repositioned it slightly, and the new angle caught a sliver of light that fell across Napoleon's face in a way that made him look older than he was. He noticed it. He did not ask for the mirror to be moved back. The months that followed the retreat from Moscow were a long, grinding descent, but they were not without moments of brilliance. Napoleon raised a new army in 1813, and he fought some of his most brilliant campaigns on German soil, with troops so young they were called the Marie Louises, boys of 16 and 17, who had never fired a musket in anger. He led them with the same energy he had shown in Italy 16 years before, but the energy was now a kind of fever. He could not sleep, he could not eat. The stomach pains had grown worse, and the medicine no longer helped. He would stand on a hill, watching the young soldiers march into battle, and his face would be empty, not cold, but empty, as if the man inside had already left. And yet, on the night after the Battle of Dresden, in August 1813, a French victory that seemed to promise a turning tide, Napoleon sat in his tent and wrote a letter to Marie Louise that was almost joyful. He described the rain, the mud, the moment when the Austrian flank collapsed. He wrote that he missed her, that he dreamed of the boy, that he would be home for the boy's birthday. The letter was the last one he would write in that mood. 10 days later, at Leipzig, the coalition armies defeated him in a battle so vast and so bloody that it took 3 days to count the dead. Napoleon retreated across the Rhine with the remnant of his army, and he never crossed back into Germany again. What strikes me most about the years 1813 and 1814 is not the scale of the defeat, but the smallness of the moments within it. The marshals beginning to argue with him openly, the diplomats who had once bowed now speaking in flat, measured tones, the servants who began to leave, one by one, finding excuses to visit their families and not returning. Napoleon noticed each departure. He said nothing, but he noticed. And at night, he would sit in his study and read old letters from Josephine, from Desaix, from his mother, and then fold them carefully and put them back in the drawer. The valets heard him sometimes, talking to the papers, as if the people in them were still alive. The campaign in France, in the winter and spring of 1814, was a masterpiece of desperation. Napoleon, with a tiny army of veterans and conscripts, outmaneuvered the coalition forces again and again, striking them at their weakest points, winning battles that should have been losses. He fought at Champaubert, at Montmirail, at Vauchamps, each victory a temporary reprieve. And the people of France, who had grown tired of war, watched him with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. He was magnificent, but he was also terrifying. A woman in a village near Reims wrote in her diary that she saw the emperor ride through the streets, mud spattered and gaunt, and that the children who ran after him did not cheer. They simply stared, as if they were watching a ghost. He was betrayed, of course. The betrayal came not from a foreign power, but from his own marshals, Marmont, who surrendered Paris to the coalition, while Napoleon was still trying to gather his forces in Fontainebleau. When the news arrived, Napoleon stood in the middle of his study, the letter in his hand, and did not move for what seemed like a minute. Then he crumpled the paper, dropped it on the floor, and said, "Ingratitude." He said it quietly, almost to himself, as if he were tasting the word. And then he sat down at his desk and began to write his abdication. The pen moved slowly, and the handwriting, for the first time in years, was steady. the abdication was not the end. There was Elba, a tiny island in the Mediterranean, where Napoleon was given sovereignty over a population of 12,000 people and an army of 1,000 men. He governed, built roads, organized a court, and bored himself to the edge of madness. The letters he wrote from Elba are filled with complaints about the weather, about the food, about the quality of the local wine. He also wrote to Marie-Louise, begging her to join him with their son. She did not come. The boy, the King of Rome, was now a hostage in Vienna, and she was no longer sure which side she belonged to. Napoleon, reading her careful, evasive replies, must have felt the last thread of his old life snapping. And yet he returned. The 100 days began with a landing in the south of France, a march through the countryside, and an army that came to him without a shot being fired. The soldiers who had been sent to arrest him instead raised their rifles and shouted "Vive l'Empereur." It was the most theatrical moment of his life, and he played it perfectly, walking toward the ranks of soldiers who had been ordered to fire, opening his coat and saying, "If any of you wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers fell to their knees. When I first read this scene, I honestly could not decide whether it was a moment of pure courage or pure calculation. Perhaps it was both. The line between the two, for Napoleon, had long since disappeared, but Europe was no longer willing to tolerate him. The coalition assembled its armies, and Napoleon marched north. The Battle of Waterloo on June 1815 was not a single catastrophic mistake, but a chain of small failures, a delayed corps, a misread map, a general who hesitated. Napoleon, watching the Prussians arrive on his flank, knew that the game was over. He rode off the field in a carriage, and the officers who saw his face said it was not the face of a defeated general, but the face of a man who had just realized that he had been living inside a story that had already ended. The exile on St. Helena was not a prison in the ordinary sense. It was a slow erasure. The island was a rock in the South Atlantic, 7,000 miles from Europe, wet and windy and empty. Napoleon lived in a damp house called Longwood, with a handful of loyal companions and a British governor who regarded him as a nuisance. He fell into a routine that was the grotesque mirror of his old life. He woke late, ate little, dictated his memoirs to Law's Cases and Monthulin, and complained about the weather. The stomach pain returned, worse than ever. The medicine did not work. The doctors disagreed about the diagnosis. Was it cancer, an ulcer, or something else? No one knows for certain to this day, and I have no definitive answer, only the fact that the man who had once moved armies across a continent now lay in a narrow bed, unable to keep down a cup of broth. But what I remember most from the accounts of those final years is a small, strange detail. Napoleon asked for a barber, and a man named Gentilini, a Corsican who had followed him into exile, came to cut his hair. The hair was thin now, gray, and there were no longer sideburns to argue about. Napoleon sat in a chair by the window, the weak Atlantic light falling across his face, and let Gentilini work in silence. When it was done, Napoleon looked at himself in the small mirror that the barber held up, and he said, "C'est fini." It is finished. Not a complaint, not a lament, just a statement, as flat as the sea outside. And if you are listening to this in the dark, with your eyes closed, imagine that moment. A man who had crowned himself Emperor of the French, who had redrawn the map of Europe, who had been the terror and the wonder of his age, sitting in a rented chair on a remote island, watching his own hair fall to the floor. He died on 5 May 1821 at 5:49 in the evening. The wind was blowing from the west, and the windows of Longwood rattled in their frames. The servants who had followed him to the end, Constant was gone by then, replaced by younger men, closed his eyes and crossed his hands on his chest. One of them later said that for a moment, just before the end, Napoleon opened his eyes and looked at the window, as if he expected to see something there. A ship, perhaps, or a face, or just the light. Then his gaze softened, and he was gone. The body was buried on the island, in a simple grave under a willow tree, and the men who had stayed with him stood in the rain and saluted. Years later, his remains were brought back to Paris, to the Invalides, to a tomb of red porphyry surrounded by marble and gold. But the mind of the man who had built the empire cannot be found in the stone. It is somewhere else, in the look of a young secretary who was made to read love letters in a steam-filled bathroom. In the ash of a letter, he wrote to a wife who did not answer. In a barber's comb moving through thinning hair on an island, so far from home that the birds did not sing in French.